12,000 years of absolute certainty ended with a missing cargo ship. The Dominion of Kesser had built an empire on one simple truth: nothing escaped their sensors. Their detection grids could track a single heartbeat across an entire star system. Their scanners identified species by biosignature from orbit. Their monitoring stations watched every corner of their vast territory with perfect, unwavering attention. In 12 millennia, no enemy fleet had ever approached undetected. No spy had ever infiltrated their stations. No threat had ever materialized without warning. Admiral Revon stood in the command center of Kesser Prime, reading the report for the third time. A cargo vessel carrying industrial supplies had vanished between two monitored waypoints. The ship's departure was logged. Its arrival was expected. But somewhere in the middle of a journey that should have taken 6 hours, it simply ceased to exist. No distress signal. No sensore namidi. No debris field. No energy discharge. Nothing. Revon had commanded Kesser fleets for 300 years. He had crushed rebellions, subjugated primitive worlds, and maintained order across 17 star systems. He knew that ships did not simply vanish. Ships left traces. Ships made noise. Ships existed within the perfect awareness of Kesser technology. He ordered a routine investigation and dismissed the incident as equipment malfunction. 3 days later, another ship disappeared under identical circumstances. Then 2 more within the same week. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Vessels entered monitored space and never emerged. The sensors recorded nothing unusual. The logs showed no warnings. Reality itself seemed to be developing holes that swallowed ships whole. Revon summoned his senior staff and demanded explanations. His officers offered theories about spatial anomalies, uncharted black holes, and experimental weapon testing by rival powers. None of the theories held up under scrutiny. The Dominion sensors would have detected any of these phenomena. That was the entire point of having the most advanced detection technology in the galaxy. Far from Kesser Prime, in the deep darkness between stars, a small vessel drifted with its engines cold and its systems running on minimal power. The ship was called the Quiet Walker, and it was doing something that every species in the galaxy believed impossible. It was hiding from Kesser sensors. Captain Lena Okonkwo studied the holographic display showing Kesser patrol routes. Her crew of 12 worked in near silence, communicating through hand signals and written messages to minimize any sound that might create detectable vibrations. Their mission was simple: observe, document, and return home without being seen. 20 years ago, humanity had made first contact with the Dominion of Kesser. The meeting had not gone well. The Kessari viewed humans as a primitive species suitable only for subjugation. 3 colony worlds fell within months. Millions of humans were enslaved. The remaining free colonies faced a choice between submission and extinction. They chose a third option. They chose to become invisible. Human scientists had studied every piece of Kesser technology they could capture or steal. They learned how the sensors worked. They identified what the sensors detected. Then they built countermeasures for each detection method, one by one, until they had created something the galaxy had never seen: a stealth system that could fool Kesser technology completely. The Quiet Walker was the result of 2 decades of desperate innovation. Its hull absorbed electromagnetic radiation instead of reflecting it. Its engines produced no thermal signature. Its mass was distributed to eliminate gravitational displacement. Every system on board was designed to produce 0 detectable output of any kind. Okonkwo watched a Kesser patrol cruiser pass within 10,000 kilometers of their position. The massive warship bristled with sensor arrays, each one scanning space with perfect precision. None of them registered the Quiet Walker's presence. The cruiser continued on its patrol route, completely unaware that human eyes were watching its every move. The crew documented patrol schedules, communication frequencies, and defensive positions. They mapped the gaps in Kesser coverage that their stealth technology could exploit. They gathered intelligence that would help humanity survive against an empire that wanted them destroyed. Back on Kesser Prime, Admiral Revon received another troubling report. A supply depot on the edge of Dominion space had been raided. The inventory showed significant losses of food, fuel, and medical supplies. The security logs showed nothing. The guards on duty reported seeing no intruders. The depot's sensors, the finest in the galaxy, had recorded an ordinary and uneventful shift. Yet the supplies were gone. Revon felt something he had not experienced in centuries: uncertainty. The Dominion's power rested on the foundation of perfect awareness. They knew everything that happened in their space. They saw every threat before it materialized. They controlled their territory because nothing could move through it without their knowledge. Now something was moving through their space unseen. Something was taking their supplies, destroying their ships, and operating with complete impunity. And the sensors that had never failed in 12,000 years showed only empty space where an enemy should be. Revon stared at the star map, displaying his vast domain. Somewhere in that sea of lights, something was hunting his people. Something his technology could not detect. Something his fleets could not find. Something that moved like a ghost through the heart of his empire. For the first time in millennia, the Dominion of Kesser faced an enemy they could not see coming. And in the darkness between stars, the quiet walker continued its silent watch, invisible and patient, waiting for the moment when humanity would step out of the shadows and change the galaxy forever. Senior analyst Dorvin had solved every detection mystery the Dominion had faced in the past century. He had upgraded the sensor grid 3 times, each improvement making Kesser awareness more complete and more precise. His reputation was built on the simple fact that nothing escaped his analysis. If something existed, Dorvin could find a way to detect it. Now he sat in his laboratory surrounded by data that made no sense. Admiral Revon had given him unlimited resources and a simple command: find out what was happening. Dorvin had run diagnostics on every sensor array in the affected regions. He had checked calibrations, examined power outputs, and verified signal processing algorithms. The equipment was functioning perfectly. Every system performed exactly as designed, yet ships kept disappearing. Supplies kept vanishing. And now his investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. Reports were coming in from stations across the border regions. Guards swore they heard footsteps in empty corridors. Doors opened and closed with no one nearby. Computer terminals accessed files without any logged users. A maintenance worker claimed he felt someone brush past him in a hallway that security cameras showed was completely vacant. Dorvin dismissed the individual reports as paranoia and imagination. But the pattern was undeniable. Something was moving through Kesser facilities without triggering any detection system. He presented his findings to Admiral Revon in a private briefing. The equipment was not malfunctioning. Something was actively evading their sensors. This conclusion should have been impossible. Kesser detection technology monitored thermal signatures, electromagnetic emissions, gravitational displacement, quantum fluctuations, bioelectric fields, and 17 other measurable phenomena. No species in the known galaxy could mask all of them simultaneously. Revon demanded solutions. Dorvin had none to offer. He could only confirm that whatever was happening violated every principle of physics and detection theory that the Dominion understood. The Admiral dismissed him with orders to continue investigating. Far across the star map, the quiet walker received new orders through a communication method that left no detectable signal. Human High Command had reviewed the reconnaissance data. The results exceeded expectations. Humanity's stealth technology worked even better than hoped. Now, they wanted proof of what that technology could truly accomplish. Captain Okonkwo gathered her crew and explained the new mission parameters. They would infiltrate Kesser Station Vorith, a military installation deep inside Dominion territory. They would access secured systems and retrieve current fleet deployment data. They would move through a facility filled with Kesser personnel past active security measures, under the watch of the most sophisticated sensors in the galaxy, and they would do it without being detected even once. The crew prepared their personal stealth suits. These were the true achievement of human desperation and ingenuity. Each suit was a marvel of counter-detection engineering, designed to make the wearer invisible to every sense and scanner the Kessari possessed. The suits bent light around the body, absorbed heat emissions, dampened sound to near zero levels, and masked biosignatures completely. Wearing these suits, humans could walk through the heart of enemy territory like ghosts. The Quiet Walker approached Station Vorith using a trajectory designed to avoid all patrol routes. They had mapped these routes carefully over weeks of observation. They knew exactly when each sensor sweep occurred and exactly how long each gap lasted. Timing was everything. The ship settled into a docking position that should have triggered 17 different alarms. None activated. The hull made contact with the station's surface without registering on any impact sensor. An airlock cycled open with no logged authorization. Point 4 operatives entered Kessler Station Vorith. They moved through corridors filled with Kessari personnel. Officers walked past them without a glance. Technicians worked at consoles while invisible humans stood at their shoulders. Security patrols marched by with weapons ready, completely unaware that the enemy they searched for was close enough to touch. Operative Yusuf reached the primary data center. He attached a device to a terminal and began downloading fleet deployment files. The information flowed silently while Kessari analysts worked at adjacent stations, discussing patrol schedules and supply logistics without any idea that their conversation was being recorded. Operative Ingrid monitored internal communications from a security hub. She discovered something that changed the mission's importance completely. The Dominion was preparing a second subjugation fleet. The target was humanity's remaining free colonies. The timeline showed 6 months until launch. This was not reconnaissance anymore. This was survival intelligence. Back in his laboratory, Dorvin worked through another sleepless night. He had pulled historical record from across the Dominion's archives, searching for any precedent that might explain the current crisis. He found nothing useful until he reached the files from 20 years ago, first contact with a species called humans. The records described them as primitive, easily conquered, suitable only for labor. 3 worlds subjugated in months. Minimal resistance. No significant technology. A forgettable addition to the Dominion's vast collection of servant races. But one detail caught Dorvin's attention. A minor note in the initial survey mentioned the humans displayed unusual tolerance for operating in complete darkness. Their homeworld had long nights, and their species had evolved to function without constant light, that a species adapted to darkness. A species that might have learned to hide in it. Dorvin began cross-referencing the current anomalies with human-controlled space. The pattern emerged immediately. Every incident clustered around the regions where free human colonies still existed. The impossible had an explanation. The Kessari were not facing equipment failure or spatial anomalies. They were facing humans who had learned to become invisible. The security footage from Station Vorith played on Admiral Revon's screen for the 23rd time. He watched a door open by itself, remain open for several seconds, then close again. No one visible entered or exited. The sensors logged no presence. The cameras recorded only empty air passing through the doorway, but doors did not open themselves. The footage continued. A computer terminal in the data center activated without any user touching it. Files scrolled across the screen. Data transferred to an unknown destination. The analysts working at nearby stations noticed nothing unusual. They continued their routine work while classified information flowed out of the most secure system on the station. Revon watched a chair move slightly, as if someone had bumped it while walking past. He watched a security panel flicker as invisible fingers accessed its controls. He watched the evidence of an intruder that no sensor had detected and no camera had recorded. Something had walked through his most secure military installation. Something had accessed classified files containing fleet deployments, patrol routes, and invasion timetables. Something had moved among his people completely unseen, and he had no idea what it was or where it had gone. Dorvin arrived with his analysis. The senior analyst had spent 3 days tracing every anomaly, every unexplained incident, every impossible occurrence. The pattern was clear now. The threats clustered around human space. The timing coincided with human activity. The targets were always valuable to human resistance efforts. Humans were doing this. Somehow, The primitive species that the Dominion had conquered 20 years ago had developed technology that made Kessler sensors useless. Revon dismissed the theory immediately. Humans were laborers and servants. They had possessed no advanced technology when the Dominion found them. They could not have developed counter-detection systems that surpassed 12,000 years of Kessler engineering. Dorvin pointed to the footage still playing on the screen. Something had penetrated Station Vorth. Something had stolen classified data. The alternative to accepting human involvement was accepting that the Dominion faced an unknown threat with capabilities beyond comprehension. The Admiral found neither option acceptable. Across the galaxy, Captain Okonkwo reviewed the intelligence her team had extracted from Vorth. The subjugation fleet was real. 800 warships were being assembled to crush humanity's remaining free colonies. The invasion timeline gave them 6 months to prepare. 6 months was not enough time to build a defense fleet capable of matching Kessler firepower. 6 months was not enough time to evacuate billions of people to unknown space. 6 months was not enough time to find allies willing to challenge the most powerful empire in the galaxy. But 6 months was plenty of time to become invisible. Okonkwo transmitted her report to Human High Command. The Leadership Council convened an emergency session. They reviewed the intelligence, analyzed the threat, and reached a unanimous decision. Humanity would not wait for the invasion. Humanity would strike first, not with fleets and weapons, but with shadows and silence. The campaign began within days. Human stealth teams infiltrated Kessler shipyards where the invasion fleet was being constructed. They moved through assembly facilities filled with workers and guards, completely undetected. They introduced microscopic flaws into weapon systems, defects so small that quality inspections would miss them, but large enough to cause failures under combat stress. Other teams accessed communication networks and planted false intelligence reports. Kessler commanders began receiving contradictory orders from sources that appeared completely legitimate. Supply requisitions were altered. Patrol routes were changed. The bureaucracy of war began to malfunction in ways no one could explain. Human operatives boarded troop transports scheduled to carry invasion forces. They sabotaged navigation computers with subtle errors that would only manifest during hyperspace jumps. They disabled life support backup systems. They loosened critical connections in engine assemblies. Every action was invisible. Every trace was non-existent. The Dominion's war machine began developing problems that no engineer could diagnose. Admiral Revon watched his invasion timeline collapse. Ships that had passed every inspection failed during trials. Cruisers lost main power in the middle of routine exercises. A destroyer's weapons array exploded during a live-fire test, killing 300 crew members. The investigation found no cause. Supply lines reported shortages that logistics officers could not account for. Fuel reserves showed unexplained losses. Ammunition counts did not match inventory records. Food supplies vanished from sealed containers. Revon demanded answers from his staff. They had none. They could only confirm that something was systematically attacking the Dominion's ability to wage war, and they could not find any evidence of how it was being done. The Admiral finally accepted what Dorvin had told him. Humans were responsible. Somehow, the species he had dismissed as primitive had learned to move through Kessler space without being detected. They were sabotaging his fleet. They were corrupting his intelligence. They were making war against his empire with weapons he could not see or counter. He ordered every security measure doubled. He commanded constant patrols in all sensitive areas. He demanded that personnel report any unusual occurrence, no matter how minor. None of it mattered. Human operatives continued their work without interruption. They walked past double guards. They moved through constant patrols. They operated in sensitive areas under maximum security. The Dominion was under attack by an enemy it could not perceive. And for the first time in 12,000 years, Kessler power meant nothing against shadows that could not be found. The Dominion High Council gathered in the Chamber of Absolute Authority, a room where the rulers of the galaxy had made decisions for 12,000 years. Every seat was filled with representatives who had never known defeat, never faced an enemy they could not overwhelm, never questioned the supremacy of Kessler power. Admiral Revon stood before them and delivered news that shattered their certainty. Humans were waging an invisible war against the Dominion. They had infiltrated secure facilities. They had stolen classified intelligence. They had sabotaged the invasion fleet being assembled to subjugate their remaining colonies. And they had done all of this without being detected by any sensor system the Kesari possessed. The council members reacted with disbelief. Humans were a conquered species. Humans had no advanced technology. Humans were suited only for labor and service. The idea that such a primitive race could threaten the Dominion was absurd. Revon showed them the footage from Station Vorith. He presented the failure reports from the shipyards. He detailed the supply shortages, the communication errors, the unexplained malfunctions that plagued every aspect of invasion preparation. The evidence was undeniable. Something was happening. Something the Dominion could not stop. The Council authorized immediate action. The invasion fleet would launch early, before human sabotage could cause further damage. Revon would personally command the armada. Every ship would be equipped with enhanced sensors and experimental detection arrays. Crews would maintain constant vigilance for any sign of invisible intruders. The Dominion would crush humanity with overwhelming force before the Shadow War could continue to in human space. Captain Okonkwo received word of the accelerated timeline. The Kesari were panicking. Their response was exactly what human strategists had predicted. Throw more ships at the problem and hope superior numbers would compensate for their blindness that IT would not work. Human High Command had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment. They had built 47 stealth vessels, each one a sister ship to the Quiet Walker. They had trained hundreds of operatives in counter-detection techniques. They had developed weapons that could be deployed without revealing the attacker's position. When the Kessler fleet entered human space, it would face an enemy unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. An enemy that could strike from nowhere and vanish without trace. An enemy that existed in the spaces between sensor sweeps and patrol routes. The Dominion was about to learn what happened when they faced opponents they could not find. Revon led his armada of 800 warships in a hyperspace. The fleet represented the greatest concentration of military power the Dominion had assembled in centuries. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and support vessels moved in perfect formation toward human territory. Every ship ran continuous sensor sweeps. Every crew remained on high alert. Security teams patrolled constantly, watching for any sign of intruders. The Admiral had ordered that nothing be taken for granted. If something seemed wrong, it would be investigated immediately. 3 weeks of travel passed without incident. No anomalies were detected. No intruders were found. No equipment malfunctioned. Revon began to hope that the human threat had been exaggerated. Perhaps their earlier successes had been luck. Perhaps the accelerated invasion had caught them unprepared. Then the fleet reached the edge of human space, and the dying began. A destroyer in the outer formation exploded without warning. The blast was massive, visible across the fleet. Sensors showed no incoming weapons. Scanners detected no attacking ships. The destroyers simply ceased to exist in a sphere of expanding fire. Before Revon could react, a cruiser reported catastrophic life support failure. Atmosphere vented from multiple hull breaches that appeared simultaneously. Crew members died by the hundreds as their ship became a tomb. A carrier's hangar doors opened while fighters were launching. Dozens of pilots and deck crew were sucked into vacuum. The doors had activated through command codes that no one had entered. Panic spread through the fleet. Ships began firing weapons randomly, hoping to hit whatever invisible enemy was attacking them. Their shots found nothing but empty space. In their desperation, several vessels struck each other, adding friendly fire casualties to the mounting losses. Revon screamed orders for calm and discipline. His voice was drowned out by damage reports, casualty figures, and the increasingly frantic communications from captains who could not identify what was killing their crews. The Quiet Walker moved through the chaos like a predator through sleeping prey. Okonkwo coordinated with 46 other stealth vessels, each one carrying teams trained for exactly this moment. They attached explosive charges to hulls. They disabled shield generators. They severed communication relays. They turned the mighty Kessler armada against itself. Revon watched his fleet crumble. Sensors showed nothing. Weapons hit nothing. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The Admiral finally understood what humanity had done. They had not developed technology to evade Kessler sensors. They had developed technology that made Kessler sensors completely irrelevant. All the power, all the firepower, all the technological superiority of the Dominion meant nothing against an enemy that simply was not there. The invasion fleet was dying to an opponent it could not see, could not fight, and could not stop. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the greatest armada the Dominion had assembled in centuries existed only as debris fields and dying signals. Admiral Revon stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final destroyer in his formation lose power and drift into darkness. Of 800 warships that had entered human space, fewer than 190 remained functional. The rest were destroyed, disabled, or abandoned by crews who had given up hope of survival. His communications officer reported that contact had been lost with over 60% of the fleet. The remaining ships were scattered across a volume of space so large that reforming any coherent formation would take days. Many of the survivors were reporting critical damage, depleted weapons, and exhausted crews. The invasion was over. The Dominion had lost. Revon ordered retreat. There was nothing else to do. Continuing the attack with his crippled fleet would only add more deaths to a casualty list that already numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His remaining ships turned away from human space and began the long journey home. The Admiral spent the return voyage reviewing every piece of data from the battle. He watched recordings of ships dying without visible cause. He studied sensor logs that showed empty space where enemies must have been. He read reports from surviving captains who described feeling utterly helpless against an opponent they could not perceive. The humans had not fought a battle. They had conducted an execution. Kessler technology was supposed to see everything. Kessler power was supposed to crush any resistance. Kessler supremacy was supposed to be absolute and eternal. All of these certainties had been proven false by a species the Dominion had dismissed as primitive servants. On the Quiet Walker, Captain Okonkwo allowed herself a moment of quiet celebration. Her crew had performed flawlessly. The stealth fleet had destroyed or disabled over 600 enemy vessels without losing a single ship. Human casualties numbered less than 50, mostly from minor accidents during the operation. The numbers were almost impossible to believe. A fleet of 47 small vessels had defeated an armada of 800 warships through nothing but superior concealment. The Kesari had never landed a single hit because they had never found a single target. But Okonkwo knew this was only the beginning. The Dominion would return. They would develop new sensors. They would create new detection methods. They would throw everything they had at solving the problem of invisible humans. Humanity needed to stay ahead. They needed to keep improving their stealth technology. They needed to expand their fleet of shadow vessels. They needed to train more operatives in the art of unseen warfare. Most importantly, they needed to show the rest of the galaxy what had happened here. The Dominion ruled through fear and the perception of invincibility. That perception had just been shattered. Other species needed to know that the Kesari could be beaten. Human diplomats began reaching out to subjugated worlds through channels the Dominion could not monitor. They shared carefully edited recordings of the battle. They showed the mighty Kessler fleet burning while invisible enemies moved among them untouched. They demonstrated that resistance was possible. The response exceeded expectations. Species that had surrendered to Kessler power generations ago suddenly remembered their desire for freedom. Underground movements that had been dormant for centuries reactivated. Communication networks hidden from Dominion surveillance began carrying messages of hope. The galaxy was waking up. Admiral Revon delivered his report to the High Council in person. He stood in the chamber of absolute authority and confessed total defeat. His invasion fleet had been destroyed by an enemy that his sensors could not detect, and his weapons could not hit. The humans had won without fighting a single conventional engagement. The Council's reaction was predictable. Some members demanded Revon's execution for failure. Others called for building larger fleets and trying again. A few suggested negotiating with the humans to understand their technology. Revon offered his own recommendation. The Dominion should request a ceasefire immediately. Not because they wanted peace, but because they needed time. Time to study the human advantage. Time to develop countermeasures. Time to rebuild their fleet with new technology. The Council debated for 6 hours. Pride warred with practicality. The idea of the Dominion asking for terms from a species they had conquered was humiliating beyond description. But the alternative was continuing a war they could not win. Finally, the Council reached a decision. They would contact the humans. They would propose negotiations. They would buy time while their scientists worked on the problem. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Dominion of Kesser would treat another species as equals. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The message was sent through official diplomatic channels. The humans responded within hours. They agreed to meet. They named a neutral location. They specified conditions that the Dominion would have rejected as insulting from any other species. The Kessari accepted every demand. Captain Okonkwo received orders to escort the human diplomatic vessel to the negotiation site. The Quiet Walker would ensure that no Kesser treachery could threaten the peace talks. She smiled as she read the mission parameters. Humanity had gone from enslaved victims to galactic power in 20 years. They had done it not by matching Kesser strength, but by removing themselves from Kesser perception entirely. The galaxy would never be the same. The negotiation chamber on Station Neutral Ground had been designed to intimidate. Massive columns rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The Kesser delegation sat on an elevated platform, looking down at where inferior species were meant to kneel and beg for mercy. The human diplomats did not kneel. Ambassador Diana Falami led her delegation into the chamber with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power she held. Her security detail walked beside her, visible and unarmored, carrying no obvious weapons. The Kessari watched them approach with expressions that mixed contempt with something new: uncertainty. Admiral Revon represented the Dominion. He had insisted on attending personally, wanting to face the species that had destroyed his fleet. He watched the humans take their seats at the negotiating table without any show of deference or fear. They looked so ordinary. Soft skin, fragile bodies, limited senses. Nothing about their physical form suggested they could threaten an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 12 millennia. Yet here they sat, treating the Dominion as equals. The negotiations began with formalities that neither side cared about. Both parties knew why they were really here. The Dominion wanted to understand how humans had become invisible. The humans wanted to ensure their freedom would never be threatened again. Folami presented her opening terms. All subjugated human worlds would be released immediately. Human territory would be recognized as sovereign and inviolable. The Dominion would pay reparations for 20 years of occupation and enslavement. Any future disputes would be resolved through neutral arbitration. Revon rejected every demand. The Dominion did not surrender territory. The Dominion did not pay reparations. The Dominion did not submit to outside judgment. Folami smiled and asked a simple question. How many more fleets was the Dominion willing to lose? The Admiral had no answer. The negotiations continued for 3 weeks. Every day, the Kesser delegation made threats they could not back up. Every day, the human delegation calmly reminded them of what had happened to their invasion fleet. Every day, the reality of the new galactic order became more difficult to deny. Outside the chamber, the galaxy was changing. News of the Dominion's defeat spread through every system. Species that had lived under Kesser rule for centuries began demanding independence. Protests erupted on subjugated worlds. Underground resistance movements launched coordinated attacks on Dominion facilities. The Kessari tried to suppress these uprisings, but they faced a new problem. Human stealth teams had shared their technology with rebellion leaders. Not the full systems that made ships invisible, but smaller tools that helped individual operatives avoid detection. Kessler security forces found themselves hunting enemies who could hide in plain sight. The Empire was cracking from within. Admiral Revon returned to the negotiating table with new instructions from the High Council. The Dominion would accept modified terms. Human worlds would be granted independence. Reparations would be discussed. The Kesari wanted only one thing in return: an end to the stealth technology sharing. Fulami refused. Humanity would not abandon the species who were fighting for their freedom. The Shadow War would continue until the Dominion learned to treat all species with respect. Revon asked what that meant. How could the Dominion satisfy human demands when those demands seemed to require the end of Kesser power entirely? The ambassador explained the human position simply. The Dominion had built an empire on surveillance and control. They had conquered species by knowing everything those species did. They had maintained power through the certainty that nothing could escape their awareness. That certainty was gone forever. Humans had proven that technology could defeat Kesser sensors. Other species were learning the same techniques. The galaxy was entering an era where the Dominion could no longer see everything. They could no longer control everything. They could no longer assume their supremacy was absolute. The choice facing the Kesari was simple. They could adapt to a galaxy where other species had power and agency, or they could keep trying to maintain control and watch their empire collapse as more and more of their subjects learned to become invisible. Revon understood what she was saying. The Dominion's age of absolute rule was ending, not because anyone had defeated them in battle, but because the very foundation of their power had been undermined. They could not dominate species they could not detect. The final agreement took another month to negotiate. Human colonies gained full independence. Subjugated species were offered self-determination referendums. The Dominion agreed to reduce their military presence in disputed regions. A new Galactic Council would be formed to address conflicts between species. Captain Okonkwo watched the signing ceremony from the bridge of the Quiet Walker. Her ship floated just outside the station's sensor range, invisible as always, watching over the diplomatic vessel that had carried humanity's representatives to this moment point 20 years ago. Her species had been conquered by an empire that considered them primitive and worthless. 20 years of desperate innovation, secret development, and silent preparation had transformed humanity into something the galaxy had never seen. They had become ghosts, shadows that moved where they pleased and struck when they chose. An entire species that could simply vanish from the perception of their enemies. The Dominion sensors still worked perfectly. They detected every ship, every signal, every heartbeat in their space. Every one except the ones that mattered. Humanity had not beaten the Kesari by building bigger weapons or faster ships. They had beaten them by removing themselves from the equation entirely. When you could not match an enemy's strength, you made sure that strength could never find you. The galaxy had new rulers now, not through conquest or domination, but through the simple truth that no empire could control what it could not see. And in the darkness between stars, human ships continued their silent patrols, invisible and patient, ensuring that the freedom won through shadows would never be lost again.